My racist mother-in-law lunged at me with a weapon. My fiancé has 24 hours to choose between us. My mother-in-law hated me from the moment she found out I existed, and it all comes down to the fact that I'm black. The first time I met her, my boyfriend at the time told me beforehand that his mom had a rough sense of humor and to try not to take things personally. I should have seen that for the red flag it was. We walked into her house and she looked me up and down and asked my boyfriend if he was going through a phase. He laughed nervously and I stood there frozen. Over the next few months, her comments got worse. She asked me if I knew my real father. She asked me why my hair did that. She made a joke about welfare when I mentioned I grew up in an apartment. Every single time, my boyfriend would tell me afterwards that she didn't mean it like that she was just old-fashioned, that I was being too sensitive. I stopped going to her house. I told my boyfriend that I loved him, but I refused to sit in a room with someone who treated me like I was less than human. He seemed to understand, and for a while things were better. He visited his mom alone, I stayed home, and we were happy. He proposed a year later, and I said yes. That's when the argument started. He wanted his mother at the wedding. I told him absolutely not. He said she was his only living parent and he couldn't imagine getting married without her there. I told him I couldn't imagine getting married with her there, making comments about how our future kids would turn out. We went back and forth for weeks. Then one day I got a text from her. She thanked me for finally coming around and said she couldn't wait to celebrate her baby's big day. I had no idea what she was talking about until I checked the wedding website and saw she had been added to the guest list. My boyfriend had done it behind my back. When he got home, I didn't yell. I told him calmly that we were going to drive to his mother's house and have a conversation, all three of us, because clearly something needed to be resolved before this wedding happened. He agreed. We drove over and she greeted us at the door with a smile like nothing had ever happened between us. We sat in her living room and I tried to explain how her words had affected me over the years. I told her that I wasn't asking for an apology for the past. I just needed to know that she could treat me with basic respect going forward. She told me I was being dramatic. She said she didn't have a racist bone in her body, and that I was looking for reasons to be offended. My boyfriend sat there and said nothing. I told her that if that was her attitude, then she would not be at the wedding. She laughed and looked at my boyfriend expecting him to override me. He stayed quiet. Her face changed. She stood up and told me I had no right to keep her from her son's wedding. I stood up too and told her I had every right to decide who was welcome at my own ceremony. She took a step toward me and called me a word I won't repeat here. I turned to leave. That's when she grabbed a glass vase off the side table and swung it at my head. I raised my arm to block it and it shattered against my forearm. I screamed. My boyfriend finally moved. He grabbed his mother and pulled her back, but she was thrashing and screaming that I had ruined her son's life. I ran out the front door with blood running down my arm and called the police from the driveway. When they arrived, she tried to tell them I had attacked her first. My boyfriend told them it wasn't as bad as it looked, but she had a Ring doorbell that caught me walking out with blood on my arm and her screaming through the window. They arrested her on the spot. I got 7 stitches at the emergency room. My boyfriend sat in the waiting room the entire time, but when he came in after the doctor left, the first thing he said was asking if I really had to call the police on his mother. I looked at him and felt something in me go cold. When we got back to our apartment, I told him I needed time to think. He asked what there was to think about. I told him his mother had just put me in the hospital, and his first instinct was to worry about her. I told him that I loved him, but I couldn't marry someone who wouldn't protect me. I gave him a choice. Either he cuts contact with his mother completely, or the engagement is over. He asked how he was supposed to just abandon his mom. I told him I wasn't asking him to abandon her. I was asking him to choose. That was 2 days ago. He's been sleeping in the guest room. He keeps saying he needs more time. I told him this morning that he has until midnight tonight to give me an answer. It's 6 p.m. now. He's been on the phone with her for the last hour. I hear him through the guest room door, his voice rising and falling in that pleading tone he uses with her, and I know with cold certainty that he's trying to justify my ultimatum instead of simply accepting it. The clock on the kitchen wall reads 6:47 p.m., and I have 5 hours and 13 minutes left to wait. My forearm throbs where the stitches pull against the bandage, a physical reminder that this isn't about hurt feelings anymore. I press my thumb against the gauze and feel the sharp sting underneath, needing something concrete to focus on besides the muffled sound of his voice explaining me to her like I'm the problem that needs solving. The apartment feels too small suddenly, like the walls are closing in, and I realize I've been holding my breath waiting for him to raise his voice, or hang up, or do anything that suggests he's defending me instead of defending his choice to give me an ultimatum in the first place. My phone buzzes on the counter, and I see Aisha's name flash across the screen for the 4th time in an hour, asking if I need her to come over. And I finally text back yes, because sitting here alone is making my thoughts spiral into dark places I can't afford to go right now. She responds immediately with OMW, and I feel my chest unclench slightly, knowing I won't have to sit through these next 5 hours by myself. 20 minutes later, I hear her key in the lock. The spare I gave her 2 years ago when we decided we were the kind of friends who needed access to each other's apartments for emergencies. And she comes through the door carrying 2 overnight bags and takeout containers that smell like Thai food. I know I won't be able to eat. She takes one look at my face and doesn't say anything, just drops everything on the floor, and pulls me into a hug that makes my chest crack open in a way I've been fighting against since we got home from the emergency room 2 days ago. I start shaking and can't stop, my whole body trembling against her while she holds me tight and makes those soft shushing sounds you make to calm scared animals. When I finally stop shaking enough to breathe normally, she steers me to the couch and sits me down like I'm made of glass, then settles beside me with her hand on my knee. She asks what I need from her tonight, and I realize I don't know how to answer that. Because what I need is for the last 2 days to not have happened, for his mother to not be a racist who attacked me, for him to have protected me instead of making me protect myself. But those aren't things Aisha can give me, so instead I just start talking, telling her everything, not just about today, but the whole pattern going back to that first meeting when his mom asked if he was going through a phase. I tell her about every racist comment I minimized, every time he asked me to give his mother another chance, every moment I swallowed my hurt to keep the peace because I loved him and wanted his family to work. Aisha listens without interrupting, her face getting harder with each story I tell, and when I finally finish, she's quiet for a long moment before she says something that hits like cold water. He's been choosing her over you this whole time. You know that, right? I nod because I do know. I just haven't let myself say it out loud until now. Haven't let myself acknowledge that the pattern was there from the beginning, and I just kept hoping it would change. Saying it out loud makes it real in a way that hurts worse than the stitches in my arm, makes me face the fact that I've been accepting crumbs of protection and calling it love. The guest room door opens and I hear his footsteps in the hallway before I see him, and when he emerges, he looks exhausted, his hair sticking up in different directions, and his eyes red like he's been crying or rubbing them too hard. He stops short when he sees Aisha on the couch beside me, his eyes going to the overnight bags by the door, and something flickers across his face that looks like hurt, or maybe fear that I'm already preparing to leave. He asks if we can talk privately, and I tell him no. Whatever he needs to say can be said in front of Aisha, my voice coming out steadier than I feel. He stands there awkwardly shifting his weight from foot to foot, opening his mouth, and closing it like he's trying to find the right words, and I watch him struggle with a detachment that scares me a little, because I used to care so much about making him comfortable. Finally, he says his mother wants to apologize to me directly, and thinks if we just talk this through, we can work it out as a family. And the words are so absurd, given that his mother put me in the hospital 2 days ago, that I actually laugh. It comes out sharp and bitter, a sound I don't recognize as my own, and he flinches like I've hit him. Aisha asks him if he's genuinely serious right now, her voice flat and dangerous in a way I've only heard a few times before, and he has the decency to look ashamed, his eyes dropping to the floor. I tell him I don't want to hear what his mother wants. I want to know what he's decided about my ultimatum, and he says he needs more time to figure out how to handle this situation. I remind him that the situation is simple. He cuts contact with her completely, or we're done. There's no handling or figuring out required, just a choice. He argues that I'm asking him to abandon his only living parent, and I feel anger flash hot in my chest, cutting through the numbness I've been wrapped in. I tell him no. I'm asking him to protect his partner from someone who tried to hurt me, and there's a difference between abandoning someone and refusing to enable their racism and violence. Aisha stands up and tells him he should go back to the guest room. Because this conversation is going nowhere, and I don't need the stress right now, and he looks at me hoping I'll contradict her, hoping I'll ask him to stay and talk this through. But I just turn away and stare at the wall, at the small nail hole where we used to have a picture of us hanging before I took it down yesterday, and I listen to his footsteps retreat and the door close again. The clock reads 7:23 p.m., and I feel like I'm watching my life end in slow motion, like I'm standing outside myself observing the death of the future I thought I was building. My phone rings and I see my sister Tiana's name flash across the screen, somehow sensing I need her even though I haven't told her what happened yet, because I couldn't find the words to make it real. I answer and immediately start crying, the whole story spilling out between sobs while Aisha rubs circles on my back, and Tiana listens to everything without interrupting until I finish. Then she tells me she's booking a flight for tomorrow morning because I shouldn't go through this alone. And I feel grateful and heartbroken that my family has to rally around me like this, that his failure to protect me means mine have to step in. Tiana asks practical questions about the apartment lease and wedding deposits, things I haven't let myself think about because they make this too real, force me to consider the logistics of untangling a life we built together. I tell her we're both on the lease with 4 months remaining. We've paid deposits on a venue and photographer totaling almost $8,000, and I have no idea how to untangle our finances because everything is joint accounts and shared credit cards. She says we'll figure it out together and that money is replaceable, but my safety and dignity aren't, which makes me cry harder because she's right, but it doesn't make the loss hurt any less. After I hang up with Tiana, Aisha suggests we watch something mindless on TV to distract me from clock watching, but when she turns it on, I can't focus on anything except the silence from the guest room. At 8:15 p.m., I hear him on the phone again, his voice muffled through the door, and I wonder if he's calling his mother back or talking to friends for advice on how to handle the impossible choice I've given him. Aisha sees me staring at the guest room door and physically turns my face toward her, her hands gentle, but firm on my cheeks, and she reminds me that his choice isn't about me. It's about who he is as a person, and whether he's capable of being the partner I deserve. I watch the clock change to 8:47 p.m. and my phone buzzes. Detective Brendan Larson's name lights up the screen and I answer on the second ring. His voice comes through professional but warm, the kind of tone that makes you feel like someone actually cares about what happened to you. He tells me my mother-in-law has been formally charged with assault and battery, that the arraignment is scheduled for next week, and that the case is moving forward regardless of what happens between me and my fiancé. I feel something loosen in my chest, knowing the legal system is taking this seriously, even if my fiancé couldn't. Detective Larson asks if I feel safe at home, and whether she's tried to contact me, and I tell him about the guest room situation, about the ultimatum I gave with 5 hours left until midnight. The line goes quiet for a moment, and then he says something that makes me sit up straighter. He says I hadn't thought about that, but now that he said it, I realize how much I need that barrier between us, something official that says she can't come near me ever again. He gives me the number for a victim advocate named Denise and tells me she can help me file the paperwork if I want. I save the number in my phone and thank him, my voice shakier than I want it to be. After we hang up, I stare at Denise's contact information for a full minute before I call her. She answers right away and her voice is gentle in a way that makes my throat tight. She asks about my injuries and how I'm doing emotionally, never pushing but making it clear she's there if I need help. I tell her about the stitches and the fear that lives in my stomach now, the way I keep replaying that moment when the vase came at my head. She listens without interrupting, and then explains how the restraining order process works, how it would legally prohibit any contact from my mother-in-law, and what happens if she violates it. The conversation is practical and calming, and by the end I agree to meet her tomorrow morning at the courthouse. Having something concrete to do besides wait for midnight feels like a lifeline I didn't know I needed. At 9 p.m., I pick up my phone and text my fiancé that I'm going to bed early, that the deadline is still midnight and it's not negotiable. My finger hovers over the send button for 3 seconds before I press it. His response comes back in under a minute asking if we can please talk face-to-face before the deadline. I read his message twice and feel anger flash through me because we've been talking for 2 days and he still hasn't made a choice. I type back that I've said everything I need to say, and the choice is entirely his now. Then I turn my phone face down on the nightstand. Aisha appears in the doorway and asks if I need help getting ready for bed even though we both know I won't sleep tonight. I nod anyway because the routine of it feels normal, and I need normal right now. She helps me change into pajamas and brings me water and makes sure my phone charger is plugged in, all these small acts of care that make me want to cry. She tells me she's setting up camp on the couch to stay with me through the night, and I don't argue because the thought of being alone right now feels impossible. I lie in our bed, my bed maybe after tonight, and stare at the ceiling in the dark. The streetlight outside casts shadows across the room, and I trace them with my eyes while my mind circles through every moment I should have walked away. The first time she asked if I was going through a phase and he laughed instead of defending me. The first time she made a comment about my hair, and he told me afterward she didn't mean it like that. The first time I swallowed my hurt to keep the peace and trained him to think my pain was negotiable. I wonder if staying through all those smaller violations made him think the big ones were acceptable too, if my silence taught him that his comfort mattered more than my safety. Then I catch myself and force the thought away because his mother's violence isn't my fault no matter how many red flags I was ignored. I knew something was wrong and I kept hoping it would get better instead of demanding better from the start. The regret sits heavy in my chest, but underneath it is something harder, something that feels like clarity. I see now what I couldn't see before, that love without protection isn't really love at all. Around 10 p.m., I hear the guest room door open and footsteps move down the hallway. My whole body goes tense listening, and then I hear the apartment door close with a soft click. He's leaving with an hour and a half until the deadline, and I don't know if that means he's made his choice, or if he's running away from making one. Aisha comes to check on me seconds later, her face worried in the dim light from the hallway. I tell her he left and we both sit there wondering what it means. Part of me wants to text him and demand to know where he's going, but I force myself to leave my phone on the nightstand. I set this boundary and I have to hold it even though the uncertainty is killing me. Aisha sits on the edge of the bed and takes my hand, her grip warm and steady. She doesn't tell me it will be okay because we both know it might not be. We just sit there in the dark while the clock ticks toward midnight, and my future hangs in the balance. My phone stays silent and every minute that passes feels like an hour. I try to imagine what he's doing right now, where he went, whether he's choosing me or her. The not knowing is worse than almost anything else. I must drift off at some point because I wake to Aisha gently shaking my shoulder and whispering that it's 11:30 p.m. My heart starts hammering before I'm fully awake and I grab my phone off the nightstand. No messages, no missed calls, no indication of where he went or what he's decided. The screen is blank except for the time glowing up at me like a countdown. Aisha asks if I want her to stay in the room with me for the final 30 minutes, and I nod because I can't trust my voice right now. She climbs onto the bed next to me and we sit with our backs against the headboard, both of us staring at the bedroom door like we can will him to appear. My hands are shaking and I clasp them together in my lap to make them stop. Every sound from outside makes me jump, thinking it's his car pulling up or his footsteps on the stairs. But the minutes keep ticking by and he doesn't come home. At 11:40, I start to accept that maybe he's not coming back at all, that his absence is his answer. The thought makes something crack open in my chest, but I don't let myself cry yet because there are still 7 minutes left. At 11:47 p.m., I hear the apartment door open and my whole body goes rigid. His footsteps come down the hall and stop outside the bedroom door. There's a long pause where I can hear him breathing on the other side, and then he knocks softly. He asks if he can come in, and his voice sounds rough, like he's been crying. I look at Aisha, and she squeezes my hand once before standing up to leave us alone. She gives me a look that says she'll be right outside if I need her, and then she slips past him into the hallway. The door opens wider, and he stands there looking completely wrecked. His eyes are red and swollen, his clothes are rumpled like he's been pulling at them, and his hair is standing up in places like he's been running his hands through it for hours. He doesn't move from the doorway, and I don't tell him to come in. We just look at each other across the room while the clock on my nightstand changes to 11:48. He finally steps inside and closes the door behind him, then sits on the edge of the bed about 3 feet away from me. His hands are shaking as he runs them over his face, and when he starts talking, his voice breaks on the first word. He tells me he drove to his mother's house to tell her in person that he's cutting contact, that what she did was unforgivable, and he can't have a relationship with someone who hurt me. He describes her reaction, and I watch his face crumple as he talks. She cried and begged him not to do this, called me manipulative, and accused me of tearing their family apart. She threatened to disown him and told him he was choosing wrong. He says he told her that if she can't respect the woman he loves, then she's already lost him, and then he walked out while she was sobbing in her living room. The words should make me feel something, but instead I just feel numb. This should have happened months ago, years ago, before it escalated to her swinging a vase at my head. I tell him that cutting contact with her is the bare minimum, not some big gesture he deserves credit for. My voice comes out flat and cold, and I watch him flinch. I ask him why it took me almost dying for him to finally choose me, and he flinches again at the words almost dying, but he doesn't argue with how I'm describing it. He admits he's been a coward who put his own comfort over my safety, that he enabled her racism because dealing with it was hard, and ignoring it was easy. His honesty should mean something, but right now it just makes me angry because where was this honesty 6 months ago when I first told him I wouldn't go to his mother's house anymore? Where was it a year ago when she asked me if I knew my real father? Where was it 2 days ago when his first response to me bleeding was to ask if I really had to call the police? He says he understands if cutting contact isn't enough, that he knows he enabled her and failed to protect me in every way that mattered. His hands won't stop shaking and he clasps them together like I did earlier. He tells me he's already been researching therapists who work with couples on racial issues and family problems, that he's willing to do whatever work is necessary to become the partner I deserve. I ask him why I should believe this time is different from all the other times he promised to set boundaries with her. He opens his mouth and closes it again, and I watch him struggle to find an answer. Finally, he says the only thing he can say, that almost losing me showed him what he was really choosing every time he made excuses for her. That seeing me run out of that house with blood on my arm made everything clear in a way nothing else could. It's not a good enough answer, but maybe there isn't a good enough answer for what he let happen. I watch the clock change to 12:01 and neither of us moves or speaks for what feels like forever. My hands are still clasped in my lap, and his are still shaking even though he's trying to hide it by pressing them against his knees. I tell him that cutting contact with his mother is only the starting point, not the finish line. If I'm going to even consider staying in this relationship, there are rules that aren't up for discussion. He can't have any contact with her at all, not for holidays or birthdays or family emergencies or anything else that might make him feel guilty. We're doing couples therapy every single week without exception. And the very first time he makes excuses for her or suggests maybe we should reconsider, I'm done, and there won't be another chance. He says yes to everything before I even finish talking, his voice desperate and pleading, and I feel so tired I could fall asleep sitting up. Agreeing to try doesn't mean I've forgiven him or that things are okay now. It just means I'm not walking away tonight. I tell him he's sleeping in the guest room and that's not changing anytime soon. Sharing a bed with him right now feels impossible when I can barely stand to be in the same room. He needs to understand that trust doesn't just come back because he made one good decision after years of bad ones. It takes forever to build trust and it breaks in seconds. He nods and his eyes are wet, but he doesn't argue or try to negotiate. He asks if he can hug me, and I say okay, even though every muscle in my body goes stiff when his arms come around me. I stand there like a statue until he lets go and walks toward the door. When it closes behind him, I hear Aisha's footsteps coming down the hall. She sits next to me on the bed and asks what I need, and I tell her I need someone to tell me if I just made the biggest mistake of my life by not ending this right now. Aisha stays with me until after 2 a.m. and we talk through everything. She's angry at him in a way that makes me feel protected, but she also says she gets that I still love him, and that love doesn't just disappear because someone hurt you. She's worried he'll do great for a few weeks and then slide back into old patterns when things calm down and the crisis doesn't feel so immediate anymore. She doesn't tell me what to do, which I appreciate because everyone else would probably just say to leave. Instead, she helps me figure out what I actually need from him, which is proof through his actions over time, not just pretty words he's saying because he's scared. Before she falls asleep on the couch, she makes me promise that I'll put my own healing first, instead of spending all my energy trying to save this relationship. I promise, even though I'm not totally sure I know how to do that. The next morning, I meet Denise at the courthouse to file for a restraining order. The building is cold and smells like floor cleaner and too many people. Denise is waiting by the security checkpoint with a folder under her arm, and she gives me a small smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. We go through metal detectors and take an elevator to the 3rd floor where the family court offices are. She walks me to a window where a tired-looking woman behind plexiglass slides papers through a slot. Denise explains what we're doing, and the woman nods like she's heard this story 1,000 times before. I have to fill out forms describing what happened, and it makes everything feel real in a different way than it did before. I pull up the photos of my stitches on my phone, and the woman behind the plexiglass looks at them without expression, before making copies. I give her the police report number that Detective Larson sent me. Denise asks me to describe the racist comments that happened before the attack, and I go through all of them, the ones about my father and my hair and welfare and going through a phase. My voice stays steady, even though my hands are shaking. The woman types everything into her computer with 2 fingers. Denise explains that the restraining order will make it illegal for his mother to contact me in any way or come within 500 feet of me. If she violates it, she'll be arrested immediately. The whole process takes almost 2 hours, and by the end I feel wrung out like a towel that's been twisted too hard. My phone buzzes while we're walking back to the elevator. It's my fiancé asking if I want him to come down here for support. I text back that I don't need him here because this is about my safety, not about us trying to fix things. Denise glances at my phone and asks if I feel safe at home. I explain the situation, how he chose me at midnight but I still don't trust him, how he's sleeping in the guest room and we're going to try therapy, but I'm not sure if trying is the same as believing it will work. She listens without interrupting and then hands me a printed list of support groups for people dealing with racist family situations. She tells me that choosing to try rebuilding doesn't lock me into anything. I can change my mind tomorrow or next week or next month if it stops feeling right. That makes me feel less trapped, which is weird because I thought commitment was supposed to feel solid, not like a door I'm keeping cracked open. Tiana shows up at my apartment that afternoon with 2 suitcases and a bag of groceries. She doesn't ask if I need her there, she just starts unpacking food into the fridge like she owns the place. That's how Tiana operates, taking charge in a way that would be annoying from anyone else but feels like relief from her. She makes me sit at the kitchen table and eat a sandwich even though I say I'm not hungry. While I'm eating, she asks pointed questions about his plan to keep no contact with his mother. How is he going to handle it when other family members pressure him? What's he going to do on Christmas or her birthday? Has he thought about what happens if she gets sick or has an emergency? I don't have good answers because we haven't talked about any of that yet. Tiana's face tells me she thinks I should have gotten more details before agreeing to try. She's not mean about it, but she's skeptical in a way that feels protective instead of judgmental. She keeps saying that actions over time matter more than promises made in a crisis. My fiancé stays in the guest room the whole time she's here. I see him peek out once to get water from the kitchen, and Tiana's eyes follow him like a hawk watching a mouse. He looks wounded by her obvious distrust, but he doesn't try to defend himself or win her over. After he disappears back into the guest room, Tiana says at least he has enough sense to give me space. 2 days later, I'm sitting in Kyra Thomas's office for my first therapy appointment. The office is small and warm with plants on the windowsill and art on the walls that looks like it was made by actual people instead of bought at a store. Kira is a black woman maybe 10 years older than me with natural hair pulled back in a bun and the kind of face that makes you want to tell her things. I sit on her couch and start crying before she even asks me a question. She hands me tissues and waits until I can breathe normally again. She asks what I need from therapy, and I tell her I need to figure out if I'm staying with him because I actually love him or because I'm scared of being alone after putting so much time into this relationship. She says those 2 things aren't opposites, that I can love him and be scared of being alone at the same time, and that therapy will help me get clear on what I actually want, instead of what I think I'm supposed to want. That makes me cry harder because nobody has said that before. That it's okay to want something even if it's not the brave choice everyone expects me to make. Kira sees me 3 more times before my first couples session with my fiancé. She says she wants to work with me individually first, so I have my own foundation and boundaries before we start dealing with him. She teaches me words for things I've been feeling but didn't know how to name. Racial battle fatigue. The invisible labor of explaining racism to white partners. The toll it takes to constantly translate your pain into language someone else can understand. She asks me to describe every time I had to manage his discomfort with his mother's racism, and I realize it was almost every interaction we had about her. I spent so much energy making him feel okay about the racist things she said that I barely had any left for my own feelings. Kira writes notes while I talk, and sometimes she stops me to point out patterns I haven't noticed. Like how I would minimize what his mother said right after it happened, telling myself it wasn't that bad, and then later I'd feel angry but I wouldn't know why. Or how I started avoiding family events not because I didn't want to see him, but because I couldn't face another round of managing everyone's comfort, except my own. Detective Larson calls while I'm making dinner one night. Tiana is still staying with me, and she sees his name on my phone screen and mouths that she'll give me privacy. I answer, and he tells me that my mother-in-law's lawyer is trying to work out a plea deal. They want to avoid jail time by having her do anger management classes and probation instead. He asks how I feel about that, and I tell him honestly that it makes me angry. I want her to face real consequences, not just some classes she'll sit through while resenting me the whole time. He says he understands and that the prosecutor will take my wishes into account. But he also explains that assault cases often end with probation for first-time offenders, especially when the person has a lawyer arguing about their age and emotional state. That makes me even angrier because the system is basically set up to protect people like her. She attacked me with a weapon, and the default is to let her off easy because she's old, and it was her first time getting caught. Detective Larson's voice is kind but firm when he tells me that sometimes the legal system doesn't give us the justice we want, just the justice it's capable of providing. A few days later, I get a call from Prosecutor Felicia Knowles. She introduces herself and says she wanted to talk to me directly about the case instead of just communicating through Detective Larson. Her voice is professional but warm, like a teacher who actually cares if you learn the material. She explains that while she would love to push for jail time, the reality is complicated. My mother-in-law is a first-time offender with no criminal record. Her lawyer is already building a defense about her emotional state and her age, and how she was provoked by me trying to exclude her from her son's wedding. Felicia says that last part carefully, making it clear she doesn't believe that defense but that a jury might. She asks if I would be willing to testify at trial if the plea deal falls through. I say yes immediately because I want her to have to face me in court and see what her racism and violence actually cost. I want her to sit there and listen to me describe every racist comment she made, and then describe how it felt when that vase hit my arm. Felicia is quiet for a second, and then she says she's impressed by my resolve. She promises to fight for the strongest consequences possible, even if that ends up being less than what I deserve. Someone knocked on the apartment door, and I heard my fiancé get up from the guest room to answer it. The voice that came through was familiar but unexpected. Javier Castro, my fiancé's best friend since middle school, asked if they could talk. My fiancé led him to the guest room and closed the door, but our apartment has thin walls and I could hear their voices rising and falling from where I sat frozen on the couch. Aisha looked at me and mouthed, asking if I was okay. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure. The conversation went on for over an hour, sometimes quiet and sometimes loud enough that I caught phrases like, "You let this happen," and "she could have died," and "what kind of man?" I tried not to listen, but I couldn't help it. When the guest room door finally opened, I expected Javier to leave, but instead he came to find me in the kitchen where I was pretending to make tea. He stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable and asked if we could talk for a minute. I said okay, and Aisha gave us space by going to the bedroom. Javier sat down at the kitchen table and told me he was sorry. No, he said he'd witnessed some of the racist comments his mother made at family gatherings over the years, and he never said anything because he thought it wasn't his place to get involved. He said he was wrong about that. He told me that silence was the same as agreeing with her, that by not speaking up, he'd been part of the problem. His honesty caught me off guard because most of my fiancé's friends had stayed completely out of this situation. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that speaking up now, to his friend about the pattern of enabling behavior, was exactly what good friends should do. He nodded and said he told my fiancé that if he backslides even once on the no-contact promise, he'll lose respect for him permanently. Javier stayed a few more minutes and explained what happened in the guest room. He said he confronted my fiancé about the pattern of minimizing and excuse-making that went back years. He said my fiancé broke down crying and talked about how ashamed he was of letting things get this bad, how he knew he'd failed me in every way that mattered. But Javier made it clear that shame without action means nothing. No. He said his friend needed to understand that this wasn't about one bad moment. It was about choosing comfort over protecting the woman he claimed to love. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing that someone else in my fiancé's life was holding him accountable beyond just me. It made me feel less alone in demanding change. After Javier left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time thinking about how many people had watched this happen and said nothing. How many family gatherings where someone could have spoken up but didn't. How my fiancé had a whole network of people who knew his mother was racist, and they all just let it continue because it was easier than confronting her. The anger came back fresh and hot. My phone rang the next afternoon and the caller ID showed the wedding venue. I'd been dreading this call because I knew we had to make decisions about our date 6 months away. The coordinator was friendly and professional when I answered. She asked if we were still planning to use the venue on our scheduled date. I took a breath and explained that we weren't canceling, but we needed to reduce the guest list significantly, and we might need to postpone. She was quiet for a second, then asked if everything was okay, and I didn't know how to answer that, so I just said we were dealing with some family complications. She said she understood and that postponement was possible, but there would be fees involved. She started listing numbers and I felt my stomach drop. I realized how many practical problems came with trying to rebuild a relationship instead of just ending things cleanly. If I broke up with him, I could cancel everything and split the losses. But trying to make it work meant rearranging our whole lives while everyone watched. The coordinator asked if I wanted to schedule a time to come in and discuss options. I told her my fiancé would handle all the vendor communications and financial penalties from here on out. She said that was fine and to have him call her. After we hung up, I felt embarrassed about having to explain this situation to strangers. And the wedding coordinator didn't need to know that his mother attacked me, or that I almost called off the engagement. But somehow having to deal with the practical details made it all feel more real and more humiliating. Tiana stayed for the whole week, and during that time, I watched my fiancé trying in ways I could actually see. He spent hours on his laptop researching therapists who specialized in racial dynamics and white fragility. He ordered books about anti-racism and left them on the coffee table where I could see the titles. He gave me space when I needed it, but also made it clear he was committed to doing the work. Tiana watched all of this carefully without saying much. She made breakfast every morning and asked me how I was sleeping. She stayed up late talking with me about whether I was making the right choice. The night before she had to fly back home, we sat on the couch after my fiancé had gone to bed in the guest room. She told me that effort was good, but consistency over months would be the real test. She said right now he was scared and motivated by the fear of losing me, but that fear would fade, and then we'd see if the changes stuck. She said she'd support whatever I decided, but that I needed to keep my eyes open and my boundaries firm. The next morning, I drove her to the airport and we sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes before her flight. She hugged me tight and told me to call her anytime, day or night. I watched her walk into the terminal and felt scared about navigating this without her steady judgment. She'd been my anchor all week, and now I had to figure out how to trust my own decisions again. 2 weeks after the attack, I walked into the couples therapist's office with my fiancé. We'd chosen a therapist who specialized in interracial relationships and family conflict. The waiting room was small and quiet. When the therapist called us back, she introduced herself and led us to her office. She had us sit on opposite ends of a couch, which felt symbolic. She asked us each to describe what we wanted from counseling. I went first because I'd been thinking about this answer since we made the appointment. I told her I needed him to understand the full weight of what his enabling had cost me. Not just the physical attack, but the years of racist comments I'd endured while he made excuses. I said I needed him to prove through actions that he'd genuinely changed and wasn't just scared of losing me. When it was his turn, he said he wanted to understand how to be a better partner and how to take apart the patterns he'd learned from his family. He said he wanted to learn how to protect me the way he should have from the beginning. The therapist wrote notes while we talked. When we finished, she looked at both of us and said we had a lot of work ahead. She explained that couples therapy after trauma was complicated and that we'd need to address both the immediate crisis and the patterns that led to it. She said the first few sessions would focus on establishing safety and trust. She asked if we were both committed to the process even when it got uncomfortable. We both said yes. The next session happened a few days later, and this time the therapist asked me to describe specific incidents of his mother's racism and his response to each one. I started with the first time we met when she asked if he was going through a phase. I described how he laughed nervously instead of defending me. Then I went through the other comments one by one. The question about my father, the comment about my hair, the welfare joke. Every time I described an incident, I also described how he reacted, how he told me not to take it personally, how he said she was old-fashioned, how he asked me to give her another chance. My fiancé sat next to me on the couch, and I watched his face while I talked. He started crying when I got to the part about that final visit to her house. I described feeling alone in that living room while she called me that word, and he just sat there frozen. The therapist asked him what he was feeling in that moment when his mother used that slur. He wiped his eyes and said he was paralyzed. He said he didn't know what to do because he'd spent his whole life avoiding conflict with her, and his brain just shut down. He said he knew it was wrong even as it was happening, but he couldn't make himself move or speak. The therapist let that sit for a minute, then told him those were explanations but not excuses. She said understanding his patterns was important, but it was just the first step toward changing them. She said he'd need to learn new responses and practice them until they became automatic. And she asked him if he was willing to do that work even when it felt uncomfortable and exposed. He said yes. The restraining order got approved 3 days later. Detective Larson called to tell me the judge had signed off on it that morning. He explained that my mother-in-law was now legally prohibited from contacting me directly or indirectly. She couldn't come within 500 feet of me. She couldn't try to reach me through other people. If she violated any part of the order, she would be arrested immediately. He said violations carried serious consequences and encouraged me to document anything suspicious. He asked if I felt safe at home, and I told him yes. After we hung up, I looked at the legal paperwork he'd emailed over. Seeing it all written out in official language made it feel more real. There was legal protection now between me and the woman who'd attacked me. But I also knew that a piece of paper couldn't actually stop someone who was determined to hurt me. It was a barrier, but not a guarantee. Still, having it felt better than not having it. I forwarded the restraining order to my fiancé so he'd know the terms too. He needed to understand that any contact with his mother, even indirect contact, could put me at risk of her finding ways to get to me. 3 weeks after the attack, Felicia called me. She said my mother-in-law's lawyer had contacted the prosecutor's office with a revised plea offer. The new terms included 6 months in jail, 2 years of probation, required anger management classes, required racial bias training, and payment for all my medical bills. Felicia asked how I felt about those terms. I told her honestly that it wasn't enough. 6 months felt like nothing for trying to bash my head in with a vase. She was quiet for a second, then explained the reality of the situation. She said taking this to trial meant risking that my mother-in-law would get off completely if the jury felt sympathetic toward her. Her lawyer was already building a defense about her emotional state and her age, and how she felt provoked by me trying to exclude her from the wedding. Felicia said she didn't believe any of that, but a jury might. She said we had to weigh a guaranteed consequence against the possibility of no consequence at all. I felt angry about the whole thing. The system was basically set up to protect people like her. She'd attacked me with a weapon, and the default was to give her a light sentence because she was old, and it was her first time getting caught. But Felicia was right that some consequence was better than none. I told her I'd agree to the plea deal even though it felt like the system had failed me. She thanked me and said she'd push for the judge to stick to the full 6 months without early release. My fiancé found out about the plea deal because Felicia copied him on some of the paperwork. That night, he came to talk to me while I was making dinner. He asked if he could pay my medical bills himself instead of having his mother's payment count as part of her consequences. He said he wanted to take responsibility for the harm his family had caused. I stopped cutting vegetables and turned to look at him. I told him no. I said his mother needed to face the financial consequence of her violence, and that him trying to shield her from that was exactly the kind of enabling behavior we were trying to break. His face fell, but he nodded and said I was right. He didn't argue or try to convince me. He just accepted what I said and walked back to the guest room. Later that night, I thought about that interaction and realized it was progress. He'd suggested something that came from his old patterns of protecting his mother, but when I called it out, he was accepted the feedback without fighting me. It was a small thing, but it mattered. I was still angry he'd suggested it in the first place, though. Part of me wondered if he'd ever fully break free of the instinct to shield her from consequences. I had my individual therapy session with Kyra the next week. We'd been meeting once a week since right after the attack, and she'd been helping me process everything. That day, she asked me what forgiveness would look like if I was able to get there someday. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't really thought about it. I sat there trying to come up with an answer and realized I didn't know. I told her I wasn't sure I wanted to forgive him. She nodded and said forgiveness wasn't required for healing. She said I was allowed to stay angry while still choosing to try rebuilding the relationship. She told me those two things could exist at the same time. I felt something release in my chest hearing that. I'd been carrying guilt about staying angry even though I'd decided to give him another chance. Like I was supposed to forgive and move on if I was going to try to make it work. But Kyra was giving me permission to feel the full mess of loving someone and resenting them at the same time. I told her some days I wanted to leave and some days I wanted to believe we could survive this. She said both things could be true at the same time. She said healing wasn't linear, and that I'd probably go back and forth between those feelings for a long time. What mattered was that I kept checking in with myself about what I actually wanted instead of what I thought I should want. I went to that therapy session the next week wondering if there was any point to talking about forgiveness when I still felt so raw. Kyra sat across from me with her usual calm expression and asked me how the plea deal conversation had gone with Felicia. I told her I'd agreed to it even though it felt like his mother was getting off easy. She nodded and didn't try to convince me I should feel differently about it. Then she asked me what forgiveness would look like if I ever got there someday. The question caught me off guard because I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. I sat there trying to come up with an answer and realized I didn't know. I told her I wasn't sure I wanted to forgive him at all. She nodded and said forgiveness wasn't required for healing. She said I was allowed to stay angry while still choosing to try rebuilding the relationship. She told me those two things could exist at the same time. I felt something release in my chest hearing that. I'd been carrying guilt about staying angry even though I'd decided to give him another chance. Like I was supposed to forgive and move on if I was going to try to make it work. But Kira was giving me permission to feel the full mess of loving someone and resenting them at the same time. I told her some days I wanted to leave and some days I wanted to believe we could survive this. She said both things could be true at once. She said healing wasn't a straight line and that I'd probably go back and forth between those feelings for a long time. What mattered was that I kept checking in with myself about what I actually wanted, instead of what I thought I should want. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Tiana flew back in the night before, and Aisha picked her up from the airport while I stayed home trying not to think about having to face his mother in court. When they got to my apartment, Tiana hugged me for a long time without saying anything. She'd brought me a new outfit to wear to court because she said I needed to walk in there looking strong and put together. I tried it on and looked at myself in the mirror. The blazer covered my scar completely. Tiana stood behind me and adjusted the collar. She told me I looked powerful, and that his mother would have to sit there and see exactly who she'd tried to break. I slept terribly that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that vase coming at my head. I kept waking up with my heart racing and my arm throbbing even though the stitches were long gone. Aisha had crashed on the couch again, and around 3 a.m. she came into my room and climbed into bed next to me without asking. She just held my hand in the dark until I finally fell asleep. The courthouse was downtown in one of those old buildings with marble floors and high ceilings that made every sound echo. We got there early, and Felicia met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. She was wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying a thick folder of paperwork. She asked me how I was holding up, and I told her honestly that I felt sick. She said that was normal and that I didn't have to look at his mother during the hearing if I didn't want to. But I told her no. I wanted to look right at her when I read my statement. I wanted her to see my face and know that I wasn't afraid anymore. Felicia smiled slightly and said that was exactly the right attitude. She explained what would happen during the hearing. The judge would review the plea agreement, ask his mother some questions, and then give me a chance to read my victim impact statement before announcing the sentence. She said his mother's lawyer would probably try to paint her as a confused old woman who made a mistake, but the evidence was too strong for that narrative to work. The Ring doorbell footage and the police report made it clear what had actually happened. We walked into the courtroom and I saw his mother sitting at the defense table with her lawyer. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan and had her hair done nicely like she was going to church. She looked small and harmless sitting there. Nothing like the woman who'd swung that vase at my head. My fiancé was sitting in the back row by himself. He'd asked if he could come for support, and I told him he could be there but not sit with us. I didn't want his mother to see us together and think we were some united front. Tiana sat on one side of me and Aisha on the other. I could feel both of them radiating protective energy. The judge came in and everyone stood up. She was a black woman, probably in her 50s, with glasses and a no-nonsense expression. Something about seeing her made me feel slightly safer. She reviewed the plea agreement out loud and asked his mother if she understood the terms. His mother said yes in this small, quiet voice that made her sound like a victim. The judge asked if she understood she was pleading guilty to assault and battery. His mother hesitated and her lawyer whispered something to her. Then she said yes again. The judge looked at Felicia and asked if the prosecution wanted to add anything before victim impact statements. Felicia stood up and gave a summary of the case. She described the months of racist harassment leading up to the attack. She talked about the vase shattering against my arm and the 7 stitches I'd needed. She mentioned the Ring doorbell footage that showed me leaving with blood running down my arm. She said this wasn't just a family dispute, but a violent hate crime motivated by racism. His mother's lawyer objected and said that was inflammatory language. The judge overruled him and told Felicia to continue. Felicia finished by saying that 6 months in jail was actually lenient given the severity of the attack and the clear evidence of premeditation. Then she sat down and the judge looked at me. She asked if I had a victim impact statement I wanted to read. I stood up and my hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. Tiana reached over and squeezed my arm once before letting go. I walked to the front of the courtroom and stood at the podium facing the judge. I could feel his mother's eyes on me, but I didn't look at her yet. I started reading my statement. I'd written it over the course of several days with Kira's help. It described every racist comment his mother had made from the first time I met her. It talked about how her son had enabled her behavior by making excuses and telling me I was too sensitive. It explained how I'd tried to set boundaries by refusing to visit her house anymore, but she'd still found ways to make me feel unwelcome in the family. Then it described that night in her living room when she'd called me that word and attacked me with the vase. I talked about the physical scar on my arm that would never fully fade. I talked about the panic attacks I'd started having. I talked about how I couldn't feel safe in my own relationship anymore because the person who was supposed to protect me had failed so completely. My voice stayed steady through most of it, but cracked near the end when I talked about how her racism had tried to destroy, not just me, but any chance of a healthy future for her son. When I finished, I finally looked directly at his mother. She was staring at the table in front of her with her jaw clenched tight. Her face was red and her hands were folded, so tightly her knuckles were white. I watched her for a long moment, waiting to see any sign of remorse or understanding. She looked up and met my eyes, and what I saw there was pure resentment. Not guilt or shame or regret. Just anger that I dared to speak about her this way in public. She looked at me like I was the problem, and she was the victim. Like I'd ruined everything by refusing to accept her treatment silently. I felt something cold settle in my chest seeing that expression. She hadn't learned anything. She didn't think she'd done anything wrong. She just resented getting caught and facing consequences. I walked back to my seat and sat down between Tiana and Aisha. Tiana leaned over and whispered that I'd done amazing. But I barely heard her because I was still processing what I'd seen in his mother's face. The judge asked his mother if she wanted to say anything before sentencing. Her lawyer stood up and said his client deeply regretted the incident and had been attending counseling to address her anger issues. He said she was a first-time offender and a senior citizen who'd acted out of character due to stress about her son's wedding. He asked for leniency and suggested probation instead of jail time. The judge looked at him with this flat expression and said the plea agreement had already been negotiated, and she wasn't interested in relitigating it now. Then she looked at his mother and asked her directly if she had anything to say. His mother stood up slowly. She looked at the judge and said she was sorry for what happened, but she said it in this flat tone like she was reading from a script. She didn't look at me once while she spoke. The judge asked her if she understood why her behavior was wrong, and his mother said yes but didn't elaborate. The judge waited like she was expecting more, but his mother just stood there silently. Finally, the judge said she'd reviewed all the evidence, including the victim impact statement and the Ring doorbell footage. She said this was clearly a premeditated attack motivated by racial animus. She said she was accepting the plea agreement and sentencing his mother to 6 months in county jail, followed by 2 years probation. She said his mother would also be required to complete anger management classes and racial bias training. She said the restraining order would remain in effect, and any violation would result in immediate arrest. Then she told the bailiff to take his mother into custody. I watched as the bailiff walked over and his mother stood up looking shocked like she hadn't actually believed this would happen. The bailiff put handcuffs on her wrists and his mother's face crumpled. She looked back at her lawyer like he could fix this somehow. Then she looked past me to where my fiancé was sitting in the back row. She called out his name in this desperate voice. I heard him make a sound behind me, but he didn't respond to her. The bailiff led her toward a side door and she kept looking back over her shoulder at my fiancé. Right before she went through the door, she looked at me one more time. The resentment was still there, mixed with something that looked like hate. Then she was gone and the door closed behind her. The judge stood up and left through her chambers. Felicia came over and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, but I felt numb. She said that was a normal response and that the sentencing had gone exactly as planned. She reminded me that the restraining order was still active and that I should contact the police immediately if his mother tried to make any contact after her release. Then she shook my hand and left. Tiana and Aisha walked out of the courtroom with me between them like bodyguards. My fiancé was standing in the hallway looking wrecked. His eyes were red and he was leaning against the wall like he needed the support to stay upright. He started to walk toward me, but Aisha stepped forward and shook her head. He stopped and just stood there watching us leave. We got outside and the sunlight felt too bright after being in that dim courtroom. I stood on the courthouse steps trying to process what had just happened. I'd watched his mother get taken away in handcuffs. I'd seen her face and knew without any doubt that she still didn't think she'd done anything wrong. Part of me had hoped that facing consequences would make her understand. But seeing that resentment in her eyes confirmed what I'd already known deep down. She was never going to change or apologize or accept responsibility. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel watching her get sentenced wasn't there. Instead, I just felt tired and sad and angry all at once. We went to lunch at a place near the courthouse because none of us wanted to go home yet. I ordered food I couldn't eat and pushed it around my plate while Tiana and Aisha talked about the hearing. Tiana said the judge had been fair, and that 6 months was actually reasonable given how the system usually handled first-time offenders. Aisha said she was glad I'd read that statement and made his mother sit there and hear exactly what she'd done. I listened to them talk but couldn't really focus on the words. I kept seeing his mother's face when she looked at me. That expression of pure resentment like I'd personally wronged her by existing and refusing to accept her racism. My phone buzzed with a text from my fiancé asking if I was okay and if we could talk later. I didn't respond. I needed time to process everything before dealing with him and his feelings about watching his mother get taken away. That night, after Tiana and Aisha had gone home, my fiancé knocked on the bedroom door and asked if he could come in. I told him yes because I knew we needed to talk about what happened. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me with this devastated expression. He asked if I wanted to talk about the hearing. I I told him I needed him to sit with the fact that his mother showed no remorse. I said she still thinks I'm the problem, and that nothing about today changed her mind. He nodded and said he knew. He said watching her refuse to take responsibility made him see her clearly for the first time. His voice broke when he said it. I asked him why it took this long. I asked him why he couldn't see who she really was, until after she'd put me in the hospital and gotten sentenced to jail. He didn't have a good answer. He just kept saying he was raised to excuse her behavior, and that unlearning that was harder than he expected. He said his whole childhood he'd been taught to ignore her comments and smooth things over. He said he'd internalized the idea that keeping the peace was more important than calling out wrong behavior. I listened to him explain, but it didn't make me less angry. Understanding why he'd enabled her didn't erase the damage that enabling had caused. 4 weeks passed after the sentencing. We fell into a routine of therapy twice a week and careful distance the rest of the time. He stayed in the guest room and gave me space. He didn't push for physical affection or try to act like things were normal. He just existed quietly in the apartment doing his own therapy homework and reading books about racism that Kira had recommended. I watched him trying, and part of me wanted to acknowledge the effort. But another part of me was still so angry that it had taken his mother going to jail for him to finally do this work. One night I was lying in bed unable to sleep, and I realized I was tired of sleeping alone. Not because I wanted physical intimacy, but because the bed felt too empty, and I was exhausted from being hypervigilant all the time. I got up and walked to the guest room. He was still awake reading by the lamp. I stood in the doorway and told him he could sleep in our bed again. His face lit up with hope, and I immediately crushed it by saying there would be conditions. I told him I was going to put pillows between us like a barrier, and he wasn't allowed to touch me unless I initiated it. He agreed without hesitation. He followed me back to the bedroom, and I arranged 3 pillows down the middle of the mattress, creating a clear division. We both got into bed on our separate sides. I lay there in the dark, hyper-aware of his presence just feet away. I could hear him breathing and feel the slight movement of the mattress when he shifted position. I wondered if physical proximity would ever feel safe again, or if I'd always have this tension in my body when he was near me. In the morning, I woke up before him and saw he was still on his side of the pillow barrier. He'd respected the boundary completely. When he woke up, he looked at me and started to say thank you for letting him back in the room. I cut him off and told him he hadn't earned gratitude yet. I said this was just the chance to keep proving himself, and that one night of respecting boundaries didn't mean everything was fixed. He nodded and said he understood. Then he got up and went to make coffee without trying to hug me or act like this was some kind of breakthrough. I appreciated that he didn't try to make it into more than it was. Our next couples therapy session was that afternoon. The therapist asked us how things had been going, and my fiancé started talking about how grateful he was that I'd let him back in the bedroom. The therapist stopped him and asked him to notice what he'd just done. He looked confused. She pointed out that he'd centered his own feelings of gratitude instead of acknowledging what it cost me to share space with him again. She said this was a pattern she'd noticed where he made his discomfort or relief the focus of conversations that should be about my experience and healing. He looked stunned, like he'd never noticed this before. She asked him to sit with that discomfort without requiring reassurance from me. I watched him struggle with it. His face went through several expressions like he wanted to apologize or explain, but he stayed quiet. The therapist turned to me and asked how I felt about him sleeping in the room again. I told her honestly that I felt tense and hyper-aware and not sure if I'd made the right choice. She nodded and said those feelings were completely valid. She said I was allowed to change my mind at any point if it became too much. Then she looked at my fiancé and told him that his job was to respect whatever I needed without making it about his feelings of rejection or hope. She said he needed to learn to sit with discomfort without requiring me to manage his emotions while I was processing my own trauma. The rest of the session focused on communication patterns. The therapist gave us exercises to practice where he had to listen to me describe my feelings without defending himself or explaining his intentions. She made him repeat back what he'd heard to prove he was actually listening instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. It was harder for him than I expected. He kept wanting to jump in with explanations or reassurances. The therapist had to stop him multiple times and remind him that his job right now was just to listen and understand. By the end of the session, he looked exhausted from the effort of holding himself back. The therapist told us this was progress even though it felt hard. She said change takes time and that I was allowed to decide at any point that it wasn't enough. Hearing her say that out loud made me feel less trapped. I'd been carrying this fear that choosing to try meant I had to see it through no matter what. But she was giving me permission to keep evaluating whether this relationship was actually serving me or just draining me. Progress was slow over the next few weeks. Some days I wanted to scream at how much emotional labor I was still doing. I was the one who had to explain why his comments hurt. I was the one who had to educate him about racism while processing my own trauma. I was the one who had to manage his feelings of guilt and shame while trying to heal from what his mother had done. It felt unfair that I was doing this much work when he was the one who'd failed me. But the therapist kept reminding me that I didn't have to do this work. She said if it was too much I could leave and that would be completely valid. She said staying and doing this work was a choice I was making, and I could unmake it whenever I wanted. That permission helped somehow. Knowing I could leave made it easier to stay and try. His mother's sister called him one evening about 6 weeks after the sentencing. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard his phone ring in the living room. He answered it, and I heard his voice get tense immediately. I walked to the doorway and watched him. His aunt was talking loudly enough that I could hear her voice through the phone even though I couldn't make out the words. She sounded angry. My fiancé listened for a minute, then interrupted her. He said he was maintaining no contact with his mother, and that decision wasn't up for discussion. His aunt's voice got louder. He said that anyone who pressured him about this decision would also be cut off. His aunt said something else, and he said he was serious and that he needed to go. Then he hung up and immediately blocked her number while I watched. He looked up and saw me standing there. He told me what happened without me having to ask. He said his aunt had been trying to guilt him into visiting his mother in jail. She'd said family should stick together no matter what, and that his mother was suffering. He'd told her firmly that he was done enabling racist behavior, and that his mother's suffering was a consequence of her own actions. Then he'd blocked her number so she couldn't keep trying. He told me all of this in a straightforward way without looking for praise or reassurance. I felt something shift slightly inside me. This is what protection looked like. Choosing me even when it cost him family relationships. Not making a big deal about it or expecting gratitude. Just doing what needed to be done and telling me about it, so I knew I was safe. 2 months after the attack, I went out to dinner with my fiancé and Aisha and her girlfriend. We were sitting at a restaurant downtown, trying to have a normal evening. The food was good and the conversation was light. I was actually relaxing for the first time in weeks. Then I heard a voice at the table next to us. An older white woman was talking to her friend about something she'd seen on the news. She said something about those people and their neighborhoods. The words hit me like ice water. Suddenly I wasn't in the restaurant anymore. I was back in that living room watching his mother's face twist with hate. I saw the vase coming at my head. I felt the glass shatter against my arm. My heart started racing and I couldn't breathe right. The restaurant felt too hot and too loud and I needed to get out. My fiancé noticed immediately. He didn't ask what was wrong or make a scene. He just stood up and took my hand and guided me toward the door. Aisha threw money on the table and they followed us out. We got outside and the cool air hit my face, but I still couldn't breathe properly. My fiancé moved me away from the entrance and started talking me through breathing exercises we'd learned in therapy. He counted breaths with me and kept his voice calm and steady. He didn't touch me more than necessary or try to hug me. He just stood there helping me breathe until my heart rate started to slow down. When I could finally talk again, I felt embarrassed. I told him I was sorry for ruining dinner. He looked at me seriously and said I hadn't ruined anything. He said trauma responses were normal, and that he was here for whatever I needed. Then he asked if I wanted to go home, or if I wanted to sit outside for a while longer. I said I wanted to sit. We found a bench away from the restaurant, and he sat next to me while Aisha and her girlfriend gave us space. After about 20 minutes, I felt stable enough to go back to the car. My fiancé drove us home and didn't make it about his guilt or his need to fix me. He just existed next to me quietly until I was ready to talk about what had happened. Kira introduced me to a support group the following week. She said it was specifically for Black women dealing with racism from white partners' families. I was nervous about going because I'd never done group therapy before. But when I walked into the room and saw the other women sitting in a circle, I felt something loosen in my chest. These women knew. They'd lived versions of my story. I didn't have to explain why a comment about my hair was racist, or why being asked about my father was painful. They already understood. The facilitator asked if I wanted to share, and I told them about the vase and the stitches and the ultimatum, and watching his mother get sentenced. The women listened without judgment. Some of them nodded like they recognized parts of my story in their own experiences. After I finished, one woman talked about her mother-in-law who'd said she didn't see color, and then asked if her grandchildren would have good hair. Another woman talked about her partner's family who claimed to love her, but voted for politicians who wanted to take away her rights. A third woman talked about leaving her marriage after 10 years because her husband kept asking her to give his racist father another chance. They shared strategies for setting boundaries and processing racial trauma. They talked about deciding whether relationships were salvageable or if leaving was the healthier choice. I listened to women at different stages. Some were rebuilding like me. Some had recently separated and were grieving. Some were years past their crisis and could talk about it with distance and clarity. I realized there was no single right answer, just what each person could live with. Some of these women had chosen to stay and rebuild and were happy with that choice. Others had chosen to leave and felt free. Both paths were valid. Both required strength. I left that first meeting feeling less alone than I had in months. 3 months after the attack, we'd settled into a rhythm. Therapy twice a week. Daily check-ins where he asked how I was feeling and actually listened to the answer. Him maintaining no contact with his mother despite her attempts to reach him through other family members. I'd see letters forwarded to our apartment, and he'd show them to me unopened before returning them with notes reiterating no contact. He was reading books by Black authors about racism and white privilege without me asking him to. Sometimes he'd share what he was learning, but in ways that showed genuine understanding, rather than performing wokeness for my approval. He'd say things like he was realizing how much he'd benefited from his mother's racism, because it meant he never had to confront her or set boundaries. Or he'd talk about recognizing his own patterns of centering his comfort over my safety. I was still angry and hurt. That hadn't gone away. But I could see him actually changing. Not just promising to change or talking about changing. Actually doing the work day after day without expecting praise or immediate forgiveness. My mother-in-law got released from jail after serving her full 6 months. I found out because a letter arrived at our apartment the day after her release. My fiancé came home from work and saw it on the counter where I'd left it. He picked it up and looked at the return address. Then he showed it to me and asked what I wanted him to do with it. I told him to return it unopened with a note reiterating no contact. He got a pen and paper right then while I watched. He wrote that he was maintaining no contact, and any further attempts to reach him would be reported as restraining order violations. Then he put the letter in a new envelope with his note and walked it down to the mailbox immediately. When he came back, I asked him if he was sad about it. He stopped and actually thought about the question instead of giving me the answer he thought I wanted to hear. He said yes, he was sad. His mother was the only parent he had left, and cutting contact hurt even though it was necessary. But he said his sadness didn't change what needed to happen. This was the first time he'd acknowledged his feelings without making them my problem to solve. He wasn't asking me to comfort him or reassure him or tell him it was okay to feel sad. He was just naming the feeling and sitting with it himself. I appreciated that more than I could explain. We were 4 months out from the attack when I realized something had shifted. I was getting ready for work one morning and my fiancé told me he was going to stop by the store after his shift. I believed him. I didn't feel the need to check his location or go through his phone later to make sure he hadn't secretly visited his mother. I just trusted that he was going to the store like he said. Later that week, I had a bad day at work and came home stressed. He asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I did. I told him what had happened, and he listened and offered support without making it about him. I let him hug me, and it felt okay. Not perfect or comfortable exactly, but okay. Small things like that kept happening. I'd accept his comfort when I had bad days. I'd believe him when he told me where he was going. I'd share space with him without feeling the need to maintain constant vigilance. The trust wasn't complete. Maybe it never would be. But it was growing in the space created by his consistent actions over months. In therapy that week, I told him I could see him trying and that it mattered. He started crying. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that ran down his face while he tried to keep his composure. He said he'd keep trying for as long as it took. He said he knew he didn't deserve another chance, but he was grateful I was giving him one anyway. The therapist reminded him gently not to center his gratitude, and he nodded and wiped his face. Then he just sat there and let himself cry without asking me to make him feel better about it. A few weeks later, Felicia called to check in on me. Her voice on the phone had that professional warmth I'd come to recognize from prosecutors who actually cared about their cases beyond just winning. She asked how I was holding up and if I felt safe, the kind of questions that made me realize she saw me as a person, and not just a case number. I told her I was doing okay, that my fiancé and I were working through things in therapy, and that he'd maintained no contact with his mother. She made a sound like she was nodding on the other end of the line, then told me something that made my stomach drop. My mother-in-law had violated her probation by trying to contact my fiancé. She'd sent him another letter despite the restraining order and the explicit terms of her probation that prohibited any contact with either of us. Felicia said the violation had resulted in additional penalties, including extended probation and mandatory additional counseling sessions. I told her about the first letter he'd returned unopened and how he'd handled it exactly the way I needed him to. Felicia said his response was perfect, and that the fact his mother kept trying to reach him showed she hadn't learned anything from the consequences she'd already faced. She asked again if there had been any attempts to contact me directly, and I said no, just the attempts through him. Felicia told me to keep documenting everything and to call her immediately if anything changed. After we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand feeling this strange mix of validation and exhaustion. The violation proved what I'd known all along, that his mother wasn't sorry and wouldn't change. But it also confirmed that my decision to require complete no contact wasn't an overreaction. She was still trying to manipulate her way back into his life, which meant she was still a threat. 5 months after the attack, we were sitting in couples therapy when something shifted in a way I hadn't expected. The therapist had been asking my fiancé about his feelings around the situation, and he started talking about being sorry for failing to protect me. We'd heard variations of this apology before, the same basic sentiment expressed different ways over months of sessions. But then he stopped mid-sentence and his face changed. He said he wasn't just sorry for failing to protect me. He said he was ashamed of the person he'd been who could witness racism happening right in front of him and choose his own comfort over doing what was right. The therapist leaned forward slightly and asked him what he was doing with that shame. He took a breath and told us he'd started volunteering with an organization that educated white people about racism and their role in dismantling it. He described going to workshops and facilitating conversations with other white people about bias and complicity, wanting to help others avoid making the same mistakes he'd made. I stared at him because this was the first I was hearing about any of this. He hadn't mentioned the volunteering or the workshops or any of it. The therapist asked him why he hadn't told me, and he said he didn't want it to seem like he was doing it for credit or to prove something to me. He said he was doing it because he needed to become a different person, not just act differently to keep me. I felt something crack open in my chest, this cautious hope that maybe the changes I was seeing weren't just surface level. The therapist asked me how I felt hearing this, and I told her it surprised me. I said it felt like evidence of actual internal change instead of just behavior modification designed to save the relationship. She nodded and asked if I trusted that the change was real, and I said I wasn't sure yet, but this was the first time I'd felt like it might be. The next session we talked about the wedding that was supposed to happen in 7 months. I'd been avoiding thinking about it because every time I pictured walking down an aisle, I also pictured explaining to guests why his entire family wasn't there. My fiancé brought it up first, saying he didn't think we should go through with it on the original date. I felt my shoulders tense, waiting for him to say something about giving his mother another chance or finding a compromise. Instead, he said he thought we should postpone it by a year to give us real time to rebuild trust and see if our foundation could actually hold. The relief that washed over me was so strong I almost started crying right there in the therapist's office. I told him I'd been feeling the same way but hadn't known how to bring it up. Planning a wedding while processing trauma felt impossible, and the pressure to perform happiness before I was ready had been crushing me. He said he would handle all the vendor communications and take care of the financial penalties from postponing. He said it was a consequence he deserved and I shouldn't feel guilty about the money we'd lose. The therapist asked how I felt about his offer, and I said it helped. I said taking responsibility for the practical fallout was part of what I needed to see from him. After that session, we drove home in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, uncomfortable silence we'd been living in for months. It felt lighter somehow, like we'd both exhaled at the same time. Aisha came over a few days later, and we sat on my couch drinking wine while my fiancé stayed in the guest room to give us space. She asked me the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. She wanted to know if I was actually happy or just committed to trying. I took a long drink of wine before answering because I wanted to be honest with her and with myself. I told her I was cautiously hopeful, but that I was still carrying hurt that might never fully heal. I said some days I believed we could survive this, and other days I wanted to pack my stuff and leave. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me that was completely fair. She said I could change my mind at any point if the relationship stopped serving me. She reminded me that staying wasn't a promise I had to keep forever, especially if he backslid or stopped doing the work. Her permission to leave if I needed to made me feel less trapped. It was strange how knowing I could walk away made it easier to choose to stay. I asked her if she thought I was making a mistake, and she said no. She said she'd seen him actually changing over the past months, and that counted for something. But she also said she'd help me pack and find a new place in a heartbeat if that's what I decided I needed. Having that support made all the difference. 6 months after the attack, we started planning a small trip together. Just a weekend away at a cabin upstate, nothing fancy or complicated. I noticed while we were looking at rental listings that I felt excited instead of anxious about traveling with him. We'd been doing weekly date nights where we focused on reconnecting as people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, instead of just partners processing a crisis. We'd go to movies or try new restaurants or walk around the park near our apartment. During those nights, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The way he laughed at my jokes and asked about my day and held my hand while we walked. The love had never actually left, I realized. It had just gotten buried under layers of hurt and anger and broken trust. Now it was starting to surface again, and alongside it came grief for what we'd lost. We couldn't go back to the innocent version of us that existed before I knew he'd choose his mother over me. That version was gone forever. But maybe we could build something new from the ruins, something more honest and harder won. I booked the cabin for 2 weeks out, and when I showed him the confirmation email, he smiled in a way I hadn't seen in months. He looked genuinely happy instead of cautiously hopeful, and I felt my own smile matching his. In my next individual therapy session, Kira asked me what I'd learned about myself through everything that had happened. I sat with the question for a while before answering because I wanted to get it right. I told her I'd learned I was stronger than I thought I was, that I could set boundaries even when it cost me everything I thought I wanted, that I could demand better treatment and walk away from people who couldn't give it to me. But I'd also learned that I deserved better than what I'd accepted for so long. All those racist comments I'd minimized and excused because I loved him. All the times I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. I deserved a partner who would protect me without needing a crisis to motivate him. Kira asked if I thought my fiancé could consistently be that person, and I told her I thought so based on 6 months of evidence. But I also said I was keeping my eyes open and my boundaries firm. I wasn't going to slip back into accepting less than I deserved just because things were getting better. She smiled at me and said that was exactly the right approach. Hope tempered with self-protection. Trust that could be rebuilt, but never taken for granted again. A few weeks later, Detective Larson called with an update about my mother-in-law. She'd completed her anger management and racial bias training as part of her probation requirements. He told me the facilitators had reported that she was resistant and defensive throughout the entire program. She'd shown up and sat through the sessions because she had to, but she hadn't actually engaged with the material or shown any real willingness to examine her beliefs. The detective's voice was careful when he told me this, like he was trying to prepare me for disappointment. He warned me that compliance with court-ordered requirements didn't mean actual change had happened. He said I should stay alert about my safety and keep following the protective measures I already had in place. I thanked him for letting me know and told him about the restraining order and my fiancé's continued no contact with her. Detective Larson said those were exactly the right steps to take regardless of what happened with my relationship. He reminded me to call immediately if she tried to contact me or if I felt unsafe for any reason. After we hung up, I thought about what he'd said about compliance versus change. My mother-in-law had sat through hours of training about racism and anger management and come out the other side exactly the same person. She'd learned nothing except maybe how to hide her feelings better. The thought made me grateful all over again that my fiancé had cut contact completely instead of trying to maintain some kind of limited relationship. 7 months after the attack, my fiancé asked if he could talk to me about something important. We sat at the kitchen table and he pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter he'd written, several pages long in his handwriting. He asked me to read it and then we could talk. The letter described everything he'd learned over the past months about racism and complicity and the ways he'd failed me. It talked about the work he was doing with the education organization and the books he'd been reading and the conversations he'd been having with other white people about their responsibility to do better. Then it asked if I would marry him. Not with grand romantic promises about forever or declarations that everything was perfect now. Instead, it asked if I would marry him with clear eyes about who he was now versus who he'd promised to be before. It acknowledged his failures and committed to ongoing work, rather than claiming he was fixed. I read the letter 3 times with tears running down my face. When I finally looked up at him, he was watching me with this expression of hope and fear mixed together. I told him yes, but that we were still waiting the full year before we resumed wedding planning. He agreed immediately without any hesitation or argument. He said he understood and that he'd wait as long as I needed. Then he asked if he could hug me, and I said yes, and let myself sink into his arms. Tiana flew in for a visit the following month. She'd been checking in regularly by phone, but she wanted to see us in person and ask her own questions. She spent time with both of us together and separately, and I could tell she was evaluating whether the changes were real. She asked my fiancé hard questions about his commitment to anti-racism work and what he would do if other family members pressured him about his mother. She wanted to know his specific plans and concrete actions, not vague promises about trying harder. His answers impressed me, even though I'd heard variations of them before. He described the workshops he was facilitating and the accountability group he'd joined with other white people working to dismantle their own racism. He talked about specific conversations he'd had with family members who'd tried to guilt him into reconciling with his mother and how he'd firmly shut down those attempts. He showed Tiana text messages where he'd set boundaries with relatives and blocked numbers when they wouldn't respect his decision. After she left, she called me from the airport. She said she was cautiously optimistic about our relationship. She reminded me that 7 months of good behavior didn't erase years of enabling, and that I should keep watching for any signs of backsliding. I told her I knew that. I said I was choosing to believe in the possibility of real change while still protecting myself. She told me she was proud of me and that she'd support whatever I decided. 8 months after the attack, I was getting ready for work one morning when I realized something. I'd gone an entire week without thinking about that night. Without replaying the moment she swung the vase or the feeling of glass shattering against my arm or the look on my fiancé's face when he asked if I really had to call the police. A whole week had passed where the trauma wasn't the first thing I thought about when I woke up, or the last thing on my mind before sleep. It felt like progress even though I knew the memory would never fully leave me. My arm still had a scar from the stitches, a thin raised line that would probably be there forever. A permanent reminder of what racism and enabling could cost. In therapy later that week, Kira asked how I felt about the scar. I looked down at my arm and traced the line with my finger. I told her it was proof I'd survived. Proof that I'd set boundaries even when it meant risking everything I thought I wanted. Proof that I was rebuilding my life on my own terms instead of accepting whatever crumbs someone else was willing to give me. She asked if I ever regretted calling the police that night, and I said no, not even once. That decision had set everything else in motion. Without it, I might still be making excuses and minimizing harm and pretending things would get better on their own. The scar was ugly, but it was honest, and I was learning to value honesty over comfort. We're getting close to 9 months since that night when my fiancé comes into the kitchen while I'm making coffee and tells me his mother's probation officer called him. She wants permission to attend a family funeral where he'll be there. I freeze with the coffee pot in my hand and wait for him to tell me he's thinking about it, that it's been long enough, that maybe we can try supervised contact. Instead, he says the request was denied because of the restraining order, and he wouldn't have gone anyway if they'd allowed her to be there. He says it without me having to ask, without me having to remind him of our boundaries, and I realize this is what real change looks like. Not grand gestures or crisis promises, but choosing my safety over family pressure when I'm not even in the room to witness it. I set down the coffee pot and look at him and feel grateful and sad at the same time. Grateful that he's finally the person I needed him to be. Sad that it took me getting hurt for him to get here. He asks if I'm okay, and I tell him yes, that I appreciate him telling me about it and handling it the way he did. We drink our coffee in comfortable silence, and I think about how different this moment would have been a year ago, when he would have agonized over the decision and made me feel guilty for keeping him from family events. Our final therapy session before taking a break from weekly appointments happens the next week. The therapist asks us each to describe where we are now compared to 8 months ago when we started coming regularly. I think about my answer for a minute before speaking. I tell her I'm healing and hopeful, but carrying scars that might never fully fade. I say I've learned to speak up for myself even when it's hard, and that I'm choosing this relationship with clear eyes instead of naive hope about who he might become. My fiancé goes next, and his voice is steady when he talks about learning that love requires action, not just feeling. He says his comfort isn't more important than my safety, and that he's committed to being worthy of my choice to stay. The therapist nods and tells us we've done hard work, and that taking a break from weekly sessions doesn't mean we stop working on our relationship. She reminds us we can come back anytime if we need support, and that the tools we've learned here are ours to keep using. Walking out of her office, I feel lighter somehow, like we've graduated from crisis management to actually building something sustainable. 10 months after the attack, we're sitting at the dining table with wedding magazines and a calendar spread out between us. We're planning a small ceremony for 2 months away with immediate family only. His mother's absence will be obvious to everyone, but we're not hiding it or making excuses. I'm sketching out ideas for my dress with long sleeves that will cover the scar on my forearm. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I want our wedding day to be about our future instead of our past. My fiancé looks up from the guest list he's working on and asks if I'm truly happy about getting married. The question catches me off guard because I thought my answer was obvious. I put down my pencil and tell him yes, that I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe we'd built something real from the ruins of what almost destroyed us. I tell him I'm not pretending the hard parts didn't happen, but I'm choosing to believe in what we've created together through all the therapy and boundary setting and difficult conversations. He reaches across the table and takes my hand, and I let him, and we sit there for a minute just looking at each other before going back to planning. The night before our wedding, I'm at Aisha's place with her and Tiana, who flew in yesterday. We're drinking wine and talking about everything that's happened since that terrible night when his mother swung a vase at my head. Aisha brings up how I handled the whole situation, and Tiana agrees, saying they're both proud of the boundaries I set, and the work I demanded, and the healing I made a priority. I think about the woman I was back then, who accepted rough sense of humor as an explanation for racism, and compare her to who I am now. The woman who knows her worth and demands protection and refuses to make herself smaller for anyone's comfort. I tell them that surviving this made me stronger, even though I wish I'd never been tested this way. Tiana raises her glass and says tomorrow I'm marrying someone who finally understands what it means to choose me. Aisha adds that our story isn't a fairy tale, but it's honest and hard-won and entirely ours. We clink glasses, and I feel tears running down my face, but they're not sad tears. Tomorrow I'm getting married, and it won't be the wedding I originally planned with all the guests and his mother smiling in the front row. It'll be smaller and quieter and marked by everything we survived to get here. But it'll be real, and built on a foundation of actual change instead of empty promises, and that matters more than any fairy tale ending ever could.